how do you pronounce your name? It's European name, not English.
That's right. But I pronounce it Karin, so the English way, even though it's spelled with an I. And then the last name is Sinniger, so it rhymes with vinegar.
Okay, Ms. Sinniger, thank you very much for joining us today.
Are you ready for this? All right.
We will give our readers a bit of context at first. So would you please explain what brought you to Bangladesh in 2017?
So I'm trying to, well, I have set a world record for scuba diving in the most countries. And so I'm always interested in discovering new countries and new unique places to dive in. And I visited Bangladesh when I was very, very young in '87 in the midst of a civil war. And I went down to Cox's Bazar. And so I always had at the back of my mind that I was going to come back to Bangladesh and dive around there. And initially there was nobody who was doing scuba diving. But then I found that actually there was a possibility to scuba dive. But one had to be careful not to dive during the monsoon season. So I had to plan. It took like maybe 2 or 3 years to plan around diving in Bangladesh, but I was happy to finally be successful. And the welcome that I got there was absolutely unbelievable. After coming to Bangladesh and meeting the local community and seeing how really passionate they were about conserving the coral reef, I've been involved for a number of years with an award-winning UK-based coral reef foundation, and they sent somebody who was a mangrove expert to view the habitat around there and make some recommendations. So yeah, it is very impressive, but unfortunately, there's in St. Martin's Island itself, there's a lot of coral reef devastation, and it's not really being taken care of and managed. So that it's a little bit unfortunate.
So you were also a marine conservationist, right?
I am not a marine conservationist. I'm a lawyer by training, and scuba diving and the underwater habitat is just a passion of mine. As a result of that passion, I've developed interests in marine archaeology, particularly, but obviously one can't dive if there's nothing to be dived on. So I think everyone who enjoys outdoor activities in their hearts is a conservationist, but I am not a marine biologist. I'm not trained in conservation techniques. It's just a byproduct of my hobby of seeing beautiful places and wanting that to be preserved, not just for myself in later years, but for future generations. I think it's very sad. I don't have any children myself, but I do have nephews and a niece. And I mean, even if I look back and think the type of diving I was doing 15 years ago, and I'm not just talking Bangladesh, I'm talking everywhere, even in like the primo dive spots, like Indonesia or the Solomon Islands. It's not like what it used to be. You've got global warming, you have the increased acidification of the oceans. You have the introduction of alien marine species in different habitats that devastate the local habitats. You have overfishing, and it's very, very, very noticeable. So I feel very sad. I'm at the point of my youngest nephew is like 13, and I'm at the point this summer of signing him up for a scuba diving class so that he can be certified. And it's just very, very sad for him that he will not be seeing what I saw when I was a child, just snorkeling. I grew up in Asia, so I was snorkeling, in the Philippines, and even scuba diving. Now it's hard to see what a snorkeler was seeing back then. So it's pretty sad. And again, this is not just Bangladesh specific. This is all around the world. In the Mediterranean, I'm based in Europe, and the Mediterranean is completely fished out.
Yeah, but there must be some amazing experiences. There must be very beautiful places that
There
can.
are amazing experiences, and it's not all in doom. It's not all doom and gloom. There is hope for humanity. There is hope to reverse this. I mentioned that I was involved in a coral reef charity. It's called Blue Ventures, and they started very small in Madagascar. And what they found is that initially, when they went there 20 years ago, there was a fishing community that had completely fished out the people. They live by octopus. That's their source of protein. So they go out on the reef, and when the tide is low, the women go out and they just fish these octopus from the low reefs, and that's they mix it with rice, and that's how they live. And they were catching all these octopus, and there was no more left. So they went to the marine conservationists and said, "Look, what can we do?" And what the Marine Conservation Foundation, Blue Ventures, found that if you go to people, you fly in and you start preaching to them, they will not be receptive. After all, the fishermen have been living there for hundreds of years, and if you tell them, don't take the coral, don't do this, don't do that, when they have to make a living, that's not going to work very well. But when you're in a situation where the community is completely vulnerable and has no choice but to take certain measures, what they did there is they said, look, just don't, for 3 months, don't do any fishing. Go to another reef. And it was self-policed by the villagers. And anybody who tried to go in and catch some octopus during that 3 months period was severely disciplined through the village elders. And, they were just pariahs with the village. And after 3 months, the octopus came back, and it was so successful that other fishing communities started asking that fishing community for advice. So they became like ambassadors for conservation. And it's now not just in Madagascar. That idea has spread from Madagascar to other countries. So, if you give the local fishermen, some basic conservation tools, it's in their interest to manage the ecosystem and the environment. Unfortunately, and they will do it, but unfortunately, there's also economic interests where, if you're going to pay people what is a lot of money for them for shark fishing, for example, or to, devastate the coral, or for shells, then you've got two competing interests. I mean, how to get money now to put food on the table for my family, with preserving for, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time for yourself or your children. So it's very difficult, but it's not without hope.
Exactly. So you were saying you grew up in Asia, but
Yes.
but where were you born? In
I
Sweden?
my parents are Swiss. Well, my father's deceased now, but my parents are Swiss. But we were I have two sisters. We were born and raised in Asia. So I was born in Hong Kong, and then we moved to Malaysia, where my sisters were born, and then from there to the Philippines and Japan. And then I finished my schooling and university in the UK, and then I moved to the US, where I got a graduate degree, and I did a lot of my career there.
They say people only care for things they see. So do you think scuba diving as a sport can motivate people to uh, look for ways to stop degradation of marine ecosystems?
Well, scuba diving I don't think will ever be a large mainstream sport because, well, to answer your question, yes. I mean, everyone who becomes a serious scuba diver, of course, is motivated to preserve the environment in which they're diving because they're diving to see that environment. In terms of, shall we encourage more people to learn to scuba dive in order to preserve the environment? I think that that's difficult because scuba diving will never be a mainstream sport because it's not easy. It's not something that you can, get up and go and immediately do. You need to be trained to do it. You need to have time during, a holiday time to learn how to scuba dive. It's not cheap. It's not like walking or running that you can just do. So I think there are other vehicles to promote conservation. I think what divers can do to help conserve is to take photos and videos and to show the underwater world. Whether that motivates somebody to take action when they're not actually, fishing or scuba diving, I don't know the answer to that question.
Going back to your childhood, would you please tell us how you became so passionate about scuba diving?
Oh, I mentioned that we lived in the Philippines for many years, and my parents rented a little beach house. Once a month, they would take us to the beach for a holiday. And it wasn't a particularly nice beach, but what it did have is corals. And, this was in the 70s, the early, say, mid 70s or so. And I would just go into the sea and snorkel. And I just loved what I was seeing. I couldn't be dragged out. So I knew that when I could and when I had the money, I would one day learn how to scuba dive. So it took me a while. It took me until I graduated from law school and I was working at a law firm in New York. Then I finally had some money to learn how to scuba dive, but I didn't have time. But fortunately, New York being the city that never sleeps, they actually had scuba diving classes that they offered from 11 p.m. until 1 a.m. in the morning. So that was perfect for me. So, and the other thing is because the pool rental fees are so cheap at that time, I learned how to dive literally for 99. I still remember it was $99 to get my scuba diving certification, which even then was, very, very cheap. So there was a little bit of a disadvantage in that the pool wasn't clean. They only cleaned the pool at 5 in the morning. So, you had some hairballs and band-aids and whatnot. But anyway, so that's how I came to learn how to dive. And then in New York, actually, you wouldn't think New York had great diving, but there are a lot of shipwrecks. New York has been an important port for a long time. And so once I learned how to dive, I dove on shipwrecks. And that's one of the reasons I have a lifelong love for marine archaeology and shipwrecks. And just gradually, my interest grew. I learned how to dive at the time when technical diving was just starting to become prominent. You had the cave divers well, you had the New York wreck divers who would go down to Florida in the winter. And so there was this cross fertilization of techniques from cave diving to wreck diving and wreck diving to cave diving. And I was just very lucky to be in the midst of that. So it just sparked my curiosity, and with different gas mixtures and different techniques, you could go diving deeper and longer. So yeah, that was a real privilege.
Yeah. So did you ever plan to set a record, or it just happened?
No, no, I never started diving to set a world record. The way that happened was, I mean, I was just diving, and because I was love to travel and see new places, I went to a lot of places. And then one day, I'll tell you, it was exactly in 2005. I went on a trip to the Chagos Islands, which are in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which normally you cannot visit. I mean, there's a whole political problem there. The US has an air base there, Diego Garcia, which they lease from the British, and they don't want anybody around. But for whatever reason, the Brits actually allowed this British marine and bird expedition to proceed there. And I was on that trip. I was lucky to go on that trip. And most of the people were birders, except there was one, an Irishman, who his only reason for going is because he's a passionate stamp collector, and he collects stamps from every out of the way place. And so he and the way he guided his trips is through, there are about 3 extreme country collecting clubs, and they have lists of places to go to. So he started talking to me about these country collecting clubs, and I realized that you need 100 you need to have been to 100 countries to join the main one. And I realized that I had the 100. And then I saw that he basically had the record for having the postcards from the most countries that he collected. One member of the club doesn't count any country on this. He can drive his car through it. And I'm like, okay, well, I love traveling. I'm now going to systematically visit these countries, and I'm going to try and dive in every single one where it's possible to dive. And, you know, some places I actually have to, like Somalia, I actually had to fly in or try and fly in like a floating compressor, but then security didn't know what that was, so they stopped it. And, you know, they were just lobster fishermen and turtle fishermen who had like this amazing hookah system, local hookah system, which is basically a garden hose attached to a compressor with kerosene. It's very, very unhealthy. But you know, just the logistics of arranging these trips, and sometimes the countries are quite dangerous. Or like, for example, in Iran, that was another one. In Iran, there's one island, Kush Island, that you can dive, but women are not allowed to dive there. There's only once a year, on one day a year, and I don't know how I managed to do this. I didn't even know that this was a problem, but I managed to get there the day that they allowed the diving, is on Iranian New Year. So they do allow the diving. Men and women have to be on separate boats. The boatman for the women has to be an old man, can't be a young man. You have to wear like a raincoat, a rain jacket over your wetsuit, you know, with a, you know, your hair covered and everything. But just those, you know, logistical and interesting cultural challenges just make it fun. So the answer to your question, no, I didn't set out to set a world record. It just happened, and I love it. And now that, even though I have the world record, I'm not stopping. So it's just fun.
So other than these embarrassing situations like in Iran, did you ever face any life-threatening situation?
I did not, but I've been on, I'll tell you 2 instances where I was on a trip where people died. So I was learning how to do cave diving, and cave diving is probably the world's most dangerous sport. The top people all end up dying. I mean, the top mountaineers, you can know their names because they survive, but the top cave diving people will eventually die, which is why I decided to stop doing that kind of dangerous diving when I was 40. I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop now because otherwise I'm going to kill myself. So I was, and cave diving is pretty difficult. So they have like two courses. You have to do an introductory course, which takes a week, and then a second course. And this is just the introductory course. So we were on this dive boat in the middle of, in the Bahamas. They have these fantastic sea caves. And the dive master, who was doing the gas mixes, so there were some very advanced divers diving in these caves, and there was us learning how to dive. I mean, we went down maximum to about 45, maybe 45 meters, which is pretty deep. The limits of recreational diving are 40 meters, and you have to be trained to do that. So below 40 meters, you really need special technical dive training. Now, if you, in addition to that, have a cave, which is very difficult, because if you have a problem, you can't just come up to the surface. That's very, very difficult diving. So anyway, this dive master decided that he wanted to be the first in the cave in the morning to get the pristine visibility, not messed up by other divers, maybe touching a part of the cave and causing particles to get into the water. And he went down to 100 meters, okay, 300 feet. And at that depth, the deeper you go, the more you get narcosis, like the rapture of the deep. It's like they have this calculation that there's a martini effect. Every 12 meters is like drinking one martini on an empty stomach. So it really makes you very, I mean, you're basically like you've had alcohol. And if you go down to 300 feet and you're trying to navigate a difficult cave and you're drunk, really drunk, you're going to have a problem, which is why you can reduce the effects of that drunkenness by breathing a certain gas combination, but it's very expensive. So this guy wanted to save money by just diving on air and not diving on trimix. And he never found his way back out. So that was one death. Another time I was on a dive boat in Egypt, and I was on a boat with Italians, and I was assigned, the only other person who didn't have a dive buddy was an Italian man. And he had some issue where, I mean, if he went below 25 meters, he would start really wheezing and being kind of as well drunk. Some people can tolerate it better than others. So for the whole trip, he was told, please do not go below 25 meters. But because he's a macho Italian guy, he kept going below and below. And one day, the dive master, the lady who was in charge of making sure that we were all not doing anything silly, she couldn't dive. And I'm like, okay, if you want to go deep, I'm just going to let you go and follow you. And, you'll see what happens and maybe you'll learn your lesson. Well, this man, he went down 25 meters, 30, 40, and I could just see that he was like totally drunk. You get tunnel vision. Some people, they just look at their computer, but it doesn't register how deep they're going, and they just keep going down. So finally, at 50 meters, I grabbed him and I pulled him up to the surface. So he would have died. He didn't die because I was there to help him, but for like a week after that, I had nightmares thinking, if I wouldn't have got this man on time, because I let him go so deep without chasing him up before, I might have had his death on my conscience. So, even for the survivors who rescue people, it can be very, very stressful. And the last incidence of death that I had was on a trip last year. This was still during the coronavirus time, early last year in Mexico. I was on a dive boat, and they took such care on the boat. You needed a PCR to get on. They were swabbing the surfaces. They made us wear masks. You couldn't get food at the buffet. They would bring you the food. Really, they took an enormous amount of care. But a crew had completed 3 trips before without any problem. they allowed one new member of the crew on board, supposedly tested, the dive master. And 2 days after we left port, he's developed a fever, was confined to his cabin, never got better. And when we left the dive boat, we were told he was going to be taken to the hospital and tested, and they would let us know if he had COVID so that we would self-isolate. Well, we flew home, didn't hear back from them for another 2 days, assumed there was no problem. And I started not being able to, I was fine, but I started not being able to taste or smell food. So I'm like, I've got COVID. I know I have COVID. And then the next day they announced, oh yeah, he and the whole crew had COVID. And so please, can we self-isolate? Now they told us that 2 days late. So then the very next day, they announced that man had unfortunately died of secondary problems due to COVID. So yeah, so that's not diving related danger, but it's trying to practice your sport during a pandemic, even though all the safety measures have been followed.
So on the contrary, you obviously have very satisfying experiences in many places. So what are the places where you want to go again and again, or you do go again and again?
Well, there's some people who go back to the same places again and again and again because they love them. And I tend to not like going back to the same places because there's always something new to see. I prefer to go somewhere I haven't been to somewhere where I have been in the past. But if you're asking me what are the nicest diving destinations that I've enjoyed, then I would say the Solomon Islands. But mind you, I dove that 15 years ago, so probably it's not the same today. That's in the Pacific near Papua New Guinea in Australia. It's fantastic diving, and it's why do I like it so much? It's because not only are there the big fish like the pelagics, schools of jacks, barracuda, sharks. There are also areas where there's smaller fish. And there's also shipwrecks, and there's also opportunities where there are crocodiles in the water, and there are also opportunities where you can go on land, and they have a very interesting culture. You have the people there who are black like Africans, but their hair will be my color, blonde or reddish color hair, the Melalitan people, and they have a very interesting culture. So it's interesting, and historically also, the Battle of Guadalcanal during the Second World War between the Americans and the Japanese have meant that there are lots of shipwrecks there to explore. So that's one. Indonesia has some fantastic diving. I mean, Raja Ampat for pelagics, and you can also, the so-called muck diving, which is diving like in mud and seeing, these tiny creatures. There are other places where you can see whale sharks and mantas. Probably the most fantastic place. I mean, I saw like 2 whale sharks with 50 mantas, just 50, literally 50, pirouetting around them. That was in the Maldives. I just came back 2 days ago from an expedition to the very remote Aldabra Islands in the Seychelles. And I haven't seen such healthy coral reefs for a long time. So, and it's completely protected. The Chagos Islands had very good diving as well because nobody's allowed there. So, yeah, there is hope. Cave diving, there's some, Mexico has fantastic cave and cavern diving. Altitude diving, Switzerland has some nice altitude diving. Probably the most unusual is Bolivia. Bolivia is a landlocked country, but they do have a navy on the highest lake in the world, Lake Titicaca. So you're diving at nearly 3,000 meters with the Bolivian Navy. Why do they have a navy? Because their Navy trains on that lake because one day they want to get back their coast from Chile. So yeah, there's very interesting and good diving all around the world. No country has a monopoly on it.
So there's all these remarkable experience and all this time under the oceans. So do you think these experiences have brought any change in your worldview? Would you be the same person if you didn't dive?
Would I be the same person if I didn't dive? I honestly, I can't imagine my life without diving. It's part of my DNA. So I guess the answer to your question is yes. Um, the answer to your question is I don't think I would be the same person if I didn't dive because it's so much of my part of my character, and I can't imagine my life would be the poorer not diving.
Yeah.
You see, the other reason that I like diving, apart from obviously seeing things, is because it's like a meditation. It's one of the few things that I've found that I can do that switches off, call it the monkey brain, always thinking, okay, I have to do this and I have to do that, and tomorrow I should do that, or ooh, this could happen in the future, or oh, you know how your brain just constantly is on a, talking. And when I dive, that just switches off and it's just silence. And I'm just concentrating on my breathing and looking at the world below, the wonders below. So it's like a meditation, and it's just such a beautiful feeling. And you're weightless and you're in warm water. It's just nice. It's really, really fantastic.
Yeah, I can see a part of what seems to be a meditating Buddha behind you, although I don't see it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that.
Correct.
Exactly.
Well spotted.
Clearly, you are concerned. You are saying that our next generation will probably not be seeing what we have seen, and you have talked about the nicest places, and you mentioned that it was 15 years back, so maybe they don't exist in the form you have seen them in. So where are we heading with this? What about the health of the planet, and what about the ecosystems and biodiversity?
Well, I'm optimistic. There's a lot of doom and gloom. I'm optimistic in man's ingenuity to solve problems with technology. I think a lot of very, very intelligent people are working to solve the problem of global warming and in the environment. But that doesn't mean that the rest of us can just be complacent and just continue carrying on. But on the other hand, it's human nature to just want to live for today rather than putting restrictions on yourself for the benefit of a future generation. I mean, most people, especially people who are not parents, will prioritize their needs over the needs of somebody else. Unfortunately, that's just human nature. So I'm optimistic that eventually technology will lead to a solution, hopefully before we've led to somewhere that's irreversible. I'm not optimistic about people's behaviors, though, about human behaviors. So I just hope that technologically we'll be able to progress before we get to a point of no return. When I said human behavior, I'm not so optimistic. I'm not optimistic from the selfishness perspective. I am, however, optimistic in terms of the example that I gave you previously about like the Malagasy fishermen, when they recognized what was happening, and that just leaving a portion of the coral reef without exploiting the resources for 3 months is all that it took to continue to be able to have access to the resources they needed. Then they did sustainable use of their ecosystems. So in that respect, I'm optimistic. So I guess the answer to your question is, it's complicated. If it wasn't, somebody would have solved this already. And I have a mix of optimism and pessimism.
So okay, so what was the last place that you dived in?
Just a few days ago, I was in the Seychelles, the Aldabra Islands of the Seychelles, which are completely, it's a UNESCO heritage site. It's completely protected. There's no fishing, nothing allowed there. And the Seychelles government is protecting it for humanity.
Yeah, so what's the next?
Oh, the next place. The next place that I'm visiting, or the next place that I'm diving?
Yeah, diving.
Diving. I was supposed to go to Tonga in August to dive and to snorkel with the humpback whales. That trip has been postponed now for 2 years. I'm not sure whether it will go ahead this year because Tonga is still officially closed to tourism. So I don't know. I don't know if that will succeed. If it doesn't, I'm planning, Asia's opened up again. So either the Philippines or Thailand. But I'm also waiting for the monsoon to end to go to, there's a place in India that I've been trying to dive, and it's been off and on, but it's finally open again. It's the Lakshadweep.
Okay,
So
Lakshadweep.
I'm hopeful to go there in September or October.
Oh, okay. That's great. Wherever you go, good luck. And thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Have a lovely evening further. It's been a delight chatting with you. And
You
good
too.
luck for the conservation, and thank you so much for what you do for conserving through your writing for humanity.
Yeah, thank
All
you very
right.
much. Bye.
Cheerio, Tanim.
Cheers.
Goodbye. It was a pleasure.